president or Republican president. The Protecting Our Democracy Act will ensure that no president can abuse their power and weaponize their office for political or personal gain. It will bar our elected leaders from placing their own personal and financial needs above the needs of the American people. It will do so through a variety of means, including the expedition of congressional subpoenas, the protection of whistleblowers and inspector generals. It'll provide an enforcement mechanism for the Emoluments Clause. It'll stiffen penalties under the Hatch Act. It will strengthen the independence of the Justice Department and ensure that no president can violate the law with impunity by tolling the statute of limitations for violations of law either before office or during office by a president of the United States. It will better protect the Congress's power of the purse and put limits on presidential declarations of emergency meant to circumvent the Congress's power of the purse. In these and many other ways, it will reinforce the norms and precedent which have protected our democracy for so long. It will essentially bar our elected leaders from placing their own personal or financial needs above the needs of the American people and ensure that the American experiment in self-government will continue and that our cherished legacy will go on. I'd like to thank Speaker Pelosi and Chairs Nadler, Maloney, Yarmuth, Lofgren, Meeks, Neal, DeFazio, and DeLauro for their invaluable partnership in pushing our democracy agenda forward. Many of my colleagues initiated concepts in this bill through legislation of their own and have championed in these issues that are so near and dear to the heart of our democracy. And I'd also like to thank the White House for engaging with us, for offering their feedback and making this a better bill. And with that, let me invite Chairman Nadler to the podium.
Well, thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking Speaker Pelosi, Chairman Schiff, and the other distinguished chairs for their leadership in putting together the critical set of reforms contained in the Protecting Our Democracy Act. Transparency and accountability are the bedrock of our democratic system. They are the essential guardrails that protect against unchecked executive power, but recent experience has uncovered weaknesses that point to the desperate need for reform in these areas. Although many of these reforms were informed by our experience with the prior administration, they are forward-looking, and they protect against abuses by any president of any party. Importantly, many of them are also based on proposals that have bipartisan support. Over the course of its oversight responsibilities, the Judiciary Committee has uncovered several areas in which reform is urgently needed. For example, Justice Department policy holds that a sitting president cannot be prosecuted, no matter how serious the crimes he or she may have committed. And when the president leaves office, particularly if he or she has served 2 terms, in many cases the statute of limitations will have run on their crimes and they will be immune from prosecution. In effect, this policy has turned the presidency into a get-out-of-jail-free card. That is why we included my legislation, the No President is Above the Law Act, which would hold the statute of limitations while a president is in office so that prosecutors could consider prosecutions after their term is over. In the prior administration, we witnessed blatant interference with pending criminal cases at the Department of Justice on matters that directly implicate the president, such as the Roger Stone sentencing, the Michael Flynn prosecution, and the Russia investigation. This is why we included Chairman Jeffries' legislation to require that the Attorney General maintain a log of certain contacts with the White House for review by the Inspector General and, where necessary, by Congress. Another vital provision in this bill would strengthen Congress's ability to enforce its subpoenas. Although the executive branch in Congress can and should usually resolve oversight disputes through a process of good faith, negotiation, and compromise, there are times when Congress must sue to enforce its rights in court. But today, the administration intent on stonewalling Congress can be rewarded by a cumbersome court process that enables the administration to simply run out the clock and to avoid any meaningful oversight. This is an invitation to unchecked executive power and abuse. That is why the Protecting Our Democracy Act, that incorporates legislation by Congresswoman Madeleine Dean, which provides an expedited, streamlined process for the House and Senate to enforce a subpoena in the courts to ensure that we can conduct proper oversights. When the nation's founders wrote the Constitution, after having just fought a war against a tyrant, they stood fast to a key principle, that the executive must not be a king and must instead be accountable to Congress, to the people, and ultimately to the rule of law. It is vital that we reassert this important principle. I am proud to join my colleagues in introducing the Protecting Our Democracy Act so that we may restore these and other checks and balances that are so fundamental to our democracy. And now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Chairwoman Maloney.
Thank you, Jerry. Good morning, and I'm very proud to be here with all of my colleagues that have contributed to this important legislation. I'm particularly grateful to the leadership of Speaker Pelosi and Adam Schiff for bringing all of these ideas together under the Protecting Our Democracy Act that will restore checks and balances, accountability, transparency to our democracy. During the last administration, we witnessed a president who retaliated against whistleblowers and inspectors general. He obstructed investigations and openly mocked the law. We now have a president and vice president who have brought decency, transparency, and accountability back to the White House. But it's important that we respond to the abuses of the last administration to prevent such horrendous behavior from happening again. The Protecting Our Democracy Act would put important guardrails in place to hold the president and his or her political appointees more accountable to the people they serve. For example, the bill would strengthen protections for inspectors general by allowing an IG to be removed only for specific reasons and preventing them from being fired for political retaliation for simply doing their jobs. The Inspector General Independence Act was introduced last year with Majority Leader Hoyer and several members of Congress, including myself, after President Trump retaliated against inspectors generals at the Department of Defense, the Department of Transportation, the State Department, and other agencies because they were conducting their oversight jobs. This protection for inspectors generals passed the House last year as part of the HEROES Act and as part of the Inspector General Independence and Empowerment Act. And we're pleased that Chair Schiff has included it in this important comprehensive statement that we are introducing today. These abuses demonstrate the need to finally establish specific protections for inspectors general in law. This package also strengthens protections for whistleblowers who expose waste, fraud, and abuse. The Whistleblower Improvement Act ensures whistleblowers are protected when they provide important information to Congress and that they have the opportunity to challenge retaliation in court, including access to a jury trial. The Protecting Our Democracy Act would also hold political appointees accountable for violating the Hatch Act, the law that prohibits inappropriate political activities by government officials. Our bill would strengthen this law by authorizing the Office of Special Counsel to send violations to the Merit Systems Protection Board for disciplinary action if the president fails to take action. Currently, career employees are often held to a higher standard than political appointees. That makes absolutely no sense, and it is simply wrong. Another important reform in our bill would prevent the abuse that occurred last year following the presidential election, when the administrator of the General Services Administration outrageously refused to grant the Biden-Harris transition team access to critical services and millions of dollars in funding following the election. Administrator Emily Murphy finally relented after I, along with Former committee chairwoman Nita Lowy and several of my colleagues standing here today sent a letter objecting to her holding up the transition and demanding a briefing. Under the Efficient Transition Act, if the GSA administrator failed to take the required step of ascertaining the winner of a presidential election within 5 days of the election, each eligible presidential candidate and vice presidential candidate would be treated as the winner until ascertainment is made or a winner is certified by Congress. Some Republicans have criticized this package as being targeted at President Trump. We are introducing this package now when President Trump is no longer in office because we are committed to reforming the law to protect future abuses, no matter who is president. I urge all of my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, to support accountability and oversight and balance of power by supporting this bill. And I yield back and introduce my colleague Zoe Lofgren, Chair of the Administration Committee.
Thank you, Carolyn. I want to thank my fellow committee chairs for joining together on this important legislation. The reforms in this bill weren't what many of us planned to do when we started this Congress, but after witnessing 4 years of the previous administration's grift, corruption, and disdain for democratic norms, it looks like they're necessary. Some of you know that many years ago, while I worked on the staff of my predecessor, Congressman Don Edwards, while he was working on the Judiciary Committee on the impeachment of Richard Nixon. After Nixon resigned, the Congress enacted a series of landmark laws and reforms to change the way politics was conducted and to prevent a future president from similarly abusing the power of their office like Nixon had done. Those measures were aimed to prevent executive abuses. They increased transparency and ethics requirements, increased campaign finance disclosure, enhanced oversight by Congress, and they worked well until the previous administration's blatant disregard for the rule of law. We saw a former president show little regard for the safeguards designed to protect our democracy throughout his term of office. And now, as it was in the aftermath of Watergate, it's necessary for the Congress to enact new reforms to restore the system of checks and balances. I want to highlight one important aspect of these reforms, which originated in the Committee on House Administration to protect our elections from foreign interference. Most Americans know that if a foreign adversary reaches out about interfering in our elections, what should you do? You should report that contact to the FBI. Instead, we saw former White House and campaign officials welcome and even solicit foreign assistance for political activities. The Protecting Our Democracy Act creates a duty to report illicit offers of campaign assistance from foreign governments, and it requires political committees, candidates, and their immediate family members to report foreign offers of assistance to federal authorities. The bill also clarifies the definition of what is a thing of value. That was something that was in doubt during various prior investigations. A thing of value includes information sought or obtained for political advantage, information like opposition research and private polling. This ensures that individuals engaging in dishonest conduct with foreign actors to influence the outcome of our elections are held accountable by the law. This reform is needed to bolster our democratic guardrails, and together, the proposals laid out by my colleagues here today reflect our determination to ensure that the foundation of our democracy, enshrined in our Constitution, will be sustained for generations to come. I'd like to thank Chairman Schiff for putting all of these ideas together, and Speaker Pelosi for her support of this effort, and now recognize my friend, Chairman John Yarmuth.
Thank you, Zoe. I'm proud to stand here today with my colleagues and particularly Chairman Schiff for thanking him for his leadership on this effort. I'm here to talk about a variation on a theme. The theme is that over the years, executive overreach has thwarted the will of the people as expressed through Congress, and particularly with regard to budgetary matters. One of the fundamental principles of the Constitution when they established a system of checks and balances was that the Founding Fathers gave Congress the power of the purse. Congress decides how to spend the people's money. But over the years, that power has been eroded by executive overreach. And it didn't start with Donald Trump, as many of my colleagues have said. As a matter of fact, this was a problem recognized back in 1974 when Congress passed the Impoundment Control Act, which basically said that it's against the law for the executive branch to spend less money or to divert money from the purposes that the Congress dictated. And we saw that then, but we saw it very vividly during the Trump administration with the withholding of funds to Ukraine in exchange for political favors, and then diverting money from the military budget to build a border wall. So what Title V of the Protecting Our Democracy Act does is to reestablish and reassert the power of the purse to Congress by creating new teeth and enforcement mechanisms in the Impoundment Control Act, because the Impoundment Control Act said you couldn't do it, but there were no penalties in it. So we're correcting that, but also creating new reporting requirements and new systems so that there's complete transparency and accountability on the part of the administration, any future administration, in regard to the congressional decisions about how to spend federal money. So we're very proud of this piece of work and hope that it receives affirmative action in the Congress. And with that, I'm honored to recognize the representative from Pennsylvania, Mary Gay Stanton.
Thank you very much. I'm not a chairman or a chairwoman, but I wanted the opportunity to speak on behalf of the rank and file members of Congress who came to Congress because we believe in our democracy. We believe in the power of government to do good for the people. There was a huge wave of us in 2018, and we came because we left our comfortable lives and our families to come to DC. Because we were appalled by what we were seeing. We were appalled by the lack of civility, the violation of democratic norms, the attacks upon a free press, upon our courts, and eventually upon our inspectors general and our election workers and our elections themselves. So for the remainder of that presidency, we played defense. We acted as a check and balance upon the worst of those impulses. Now it is time to move forward. And in doing that, the Protect Our Democracy Act is so, so important. Really pleased to be able to be here with all the chairmen. Thank you so much to Chairman Schiff for that work. And that's where we need to go. The two options are, you say, well, the last one got away with it, we should do more. No, that's not how we roll here. We're here to make sure that the guardrails on our democracy are strengthened and that we move forward. Thank you. And I would yield to Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon of the great state of Pennsylvania, for your tremendous leadership to protect our democracy. My apologies for being late. I was on the Mall where we had over 675,000 white flags fluttering in the wind as the number of people who have died from COVID. It was a work of art, and as you know, art is open to interpretation. We didn't want white flags to be surrender. We want them to be fluttering as a sign of life of the people who were here, lives lost, families missing them at the dinner table, and the rest. And we're dangerously close to 700,000, which by some miracle we hope we never achieve. But we're making the point that we have now surpassed the number of people who died, surpassed the Spanish flu 100 years ago. You would think with science and awareness and communication that we would have done better. But the rejection of science and the misrepresentation in communication has taken us to a place we are. Thank God for President Biden for putting us on a different course where over 150,000 people have been fully vaccinated and more vaccinations. That's back on the uptick. That's my reason for being late. My reason for being here is as simple as the title, Protecting Our Democracy Act. And I want to thank the mover and shaker of this, primarily Congressman Mr. Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Schiff. We got our Adams here. Smith is on the floor shortly. Adam Schiff. Adam Schiff has been protecting our democracy ever since he stepped into the public arena. More recently, more conspicuously, in protecting our democracy from destroying the separation of power. I'm honored to be here with Mr. Nadler, who has been a champion on this issue. I mean, such a long time, well before Congress, and when he speaks about it, he's such an inspiration. Congresswoman Maloney from the Oversight Committee, which has jurisdiction here, Congresswoman Zolofgren, a leader in the Judiciary Committee and a chair of her own committee, House Administration, and Mr. Yarmuth, the chair of the Budget Committee. He's a very busy man all the time. He has more hours in the day than the rest of us right now. He said he's happy to be here under the mask. And I'm happy to be here with each and every one of you and to represent so many in our caucus who find this legislation absolutely essential. It didn't begin just now. They have been working on this for a while. It had its resistance before. We think that we will be successful now. The separation of power is the genius of the Constitution of the United States. It is exquisitely beautiful, and it is the essence of a democracy. And in these provisions in the bill, which I know have been expertly addressed, so I'll associate myself with that expertise, shows you why we have to codify this, turn it into law, so that no president of whatever party can ever assume that he or she has the power to usurp the power of the other branches of government. And it is specific in its remedies and its inoculations against future abuse. So being Italian-American, we take special ownership of the separation of power because we think it was an inspiration to Thomas Jefferson when he visited Italy when he was an ambassador in Europe. So apart from everything else, the exquisite, as I said, exquisite beauty of our Constitution is that no person or no branch of government, the separation of power just is a remarkable feature of a democracy, not only led by America, but copied by other countries. We must protect it, and in doing so, protect our democracy. Congratulations to all of you for bringing this forward now and hopefully soon to the floor. Thank you, Mr. I yield the floor now to the distinguished chair of the Intelligence Committee, Chairman Adam Schiff.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and we'd be pleased to take your questions. Yes.
The bill reads like a rap sheet of Trump-era abuses. Republicans, frequently cite what they see as rebukes of Trump as justifications not to vote for certain legislation. So, do you think that this can pass the Senate, or the filibuster requires 10 Republican votes to pass legislation?
Well, one step at a time. We'll be, I hope, taking this up in the House this fall, and it has very strong support here in the House. It should have strong support in the Senate. There are many provisions within this bill, components of this bill, that had primary Republican authors in the past. I think there ought to be a view among GOP members of the House conference as well as the Senate that these are good government reforms no matter who the president is. Now, I realize that many of the Republican members live in fear of angry statements from the former president. And that, when we introduced this bill last session, certainly chilled Republicans from supporting it. I would hope that now that that administration has receded into the past, that Republican members will recognize, as Democrats do, that it shouldn't matter who the President of the United States is. We should want that president not to be able to abuse that office to enrich themselves. We should want them to maintain independence from the Justice Department, not use it as their own private law firm, not use it to go after their adversaries. We should want both Democrats and Republicans to revert to form when both parties strongly supported whistleblowers and strongly supported inspectors general. Some of the leading champions in the Senate were champions of inspector generals and their independence. So we would hope that as time passes between this administration and the last, that Republicans recognize, as we do, the imperative of restoring these protections for our democracy.
Madam Speaker, you will be meeting the president of Angola in a few hours, I think. Would you share with us your expectation from the meeting and what the Angolan people can expect in terms of result from this meeting with the President, João Lourenço?
Well, I'll be happy to answer that question after we meet. I'll be joined by Congresswoman Karen Bass, Madam Chair of the Africa Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee. But right now, we'd like to just stay focused on what we're here about, and I'll have some comments later. And I'm very excited about the meeting. I'm looking forward to it very much.
Yes.
Can you characterize the current White House's involvement in this bill? Are they supportive of every piece of it, and what changes did they recommend?
They have been engaging with us for months now very constructively. They have made any number of suggestions for different components in terms of concerns over executive prerogative, and we have made every good faith effort we can to meet the concerns that have been expressed. I can't say we've reached agreement on each and every one, but we made changes, for example, to some of the provisions that would individually penalize people for refusing congressional subpoenas, to provide that in the case where there's an explicit claim of privilege, where there is an explicit instruction to someone, that could be stipulated to the court. And in other ways, we have tweaked some of the provisions to try to accommodate those concerns. For example, with respect to the independence of the Justice Department, we have redacted a provision that would require internal communications. So we have accommodated their feedback, but we're not in complete accord, and we will continue to be working with the executive. As you might expect, we take a Article 1 perspective of these issues. They take an Article 2 perspective. But President Biden has acknowledged the central importance of these kind of reforms, both during his campaign and during his presidency. And so we expect that we will continue to refine the provision as it moves along. Yes.
The Speaker talked about separation of powers. You just kind of alluded to this a little bit. Is the existence of this bill a kind of acknowledgement that the modern presidency has gotten too powerful?
Well, I think it is, and I'll invite my colleagues to add their thoughts. We have seen over the last several decades an accretion of power by the executive. But what was also very revealing in the last 4 years is that so many of our current checks and balances really depended on members of Congress of both parties having a deep, abiding conviction of support for their own institution, that each would jealously guard their own institution. And that broke down when members were more devoted to the person of the president than they were to the institution. And that's made, I think, many of these reforms necessary. But you're right. In innumerable ways, there has been this slow accretion of power within the executive, and this is, I hope, the beginning of a corrective. And Madam Speaker, did you want to address that as well? And my colleagues.
Well, I would just say that you said the slow, but it went rapidly under the previous president. When we talk about this legislation, we're talking about restoring ethics and the rule of law. We're talking about establishing key safeguards. Our founders, in their wisdom, had a system of checks and balances and separation of powers, and they had guardrails for the president, and one of them was the Congress of the United States. They could foresee a rogue president human nature, but they, I don't think, could foresee a rogue president and a rogue Congress, and that's what we had. And again, those safeguards need to be there, and preventing assaults on our democracy by whatever safeguards we have for whistleblowers and the rest. And we saw in the last administration the abuse of power in terms of the use of pardon and the rest, without shall we say, routine that fairness would require. So again, to restore the vision of our founders, the government formed by the people. Thank you for restoring our democracy. But I agree that there's been a slow movement, but it picked up steam in the last presidency. Excuse me.
I have a question. I know you said you wanted
The,
to, sorry.
I want to add that when you talk about the slow accretion of power, just one example, congressional subpoenas. Congress can't function without getting information from the executive branch. And so we've used subpoenas for that purpose, as you do in civil law. But the last administration simply refused to comply with subpoenas. The president announced he would defy all subpoenas. That's a quote. I will defy all subpoenas. And he instructed all his subordinates to defy all subpoenas. And we found that we couldn't enforce our subpoenas because they would run out the clock. You'd go into court with a subpoena, and it would go on and on and on and run out the clock, so that the subpoena was useless, and Congress couldn't get the information it needed. So part of this bill is legislation to say you can't do that. Is legislation to put very strict time limits on the subpoenas. That's just one example of the kind of accretion of power, and especially under this last administration, that we have to put an end to, and that we will.
And very briefly, the inspectors general, whose job it is to oversee any suspected wrongdoing, anyone who started an investigation was removed, just removed from their position with no reason except that they had started an investigation that they didn't like. And the same thing with, you saw it with whistleblowers. They need to be protected, and they ferociously went after whistleblowers.
I'll make this the last question.
I know you guys said you want to stay on the topic, but I'm just going to give this a shot. So the UN, the head of the UN just said that they're warning of a Cold War between the U.S. and China, and they're saying that we need to repair relations with China, trying to nudge U.S. against any wrong actions toward China. What is your response to that, considering the fundamental difference between China and the U.S. when it comes to like human rights abuses and things?
I'm happy to respond to you as soon as we break, but I would like to keep the questions confined to the Protecting Our Democracy Act, so why don't we make this the last question?
Thank you, Chairman Schiff. I was wondering what role President Trump potentially running again in 2024 had anything to do with reintroducing this now in your thoughts process?
Well, I introduced this package last session, and I think as we have all expressed, this is important regardless of whether the former president runs again or we have some other president in the future who intends to break down the guardrails of our democratic institutions. So we view this as important for all future presidencies. And we hope that our colleagues across the aisle will view it the same way. They're as mindful as we are of not wanting to see these abuses take place again. They certainly wouldn't want a Democratic president to abuse their power the way the last president did. So just as with Watergate, yes, in part it was a look at what took place during that administration, but it was also, more importantly, a look forward to make sure that those kind of abuses didn't recur, and that's our intent as well. Thank you very much.